Exercise 1.1. We have number 1, I squared. So don't forget, you need to remember those two rules in the box. I is equal to square root of minus 1. I squared is equal to minus 1. So where you see I squared, you will substitute negative 1. Does it make sense? So if you see I squared, you could substitute minus 1. So the answer is minus 1. Now notice in this example, for I am substituting root minus 1. I'm not substituting for I squared. But if I did, I squared is equal to minus 1. So the answer is minus 1, no doubt. However, for I alone, I am substituting square root of minus 1. Now I will have to square that, okay, because it's I squared. Does that make sense? So the square root sign will cancel the square. I'll get an answer of minus 1. So I squared is minus 1. Correct. The next question is I to the power 7. Pause the video, see if you can do this one. So the two things to think of here is I squared. Every time you are using a value, you need to use I squared or in reverse to get the answer, or I, or whatever the case might be. Alright, so if you see root minus 1, you will place I there. If you see I, you will place root minus 1. If you see I squared there, you will place minus 1. So if you don't see I squared, that means you have to insert I squared so that you can later turn that into a minus 1. Does it make sense? Let's do this one. So this is what I mean. I insert I squared because I squared is minus 1. Now notice I squared to the power 3. I don't think you might remember this rule. You might have forgotten. But when you have something called a power raised to a power on the outside of the bracket, we do not add the 2 and the 3, but instead we multiply the 2 times the 3. So 2 times 3 will give us 6. So we have I to the 6. So notice in that question, the question was I to the 7. So I to the power 7. We only have I to the 6, which means we are short of 1 I. So times I, if we add up the powers now, we'll get I to the 6 plus I to the 1 will give us I to the 7. So I to the 6 plus I to the 1 will give us I to the 7. So at this point, the left hand side is equal to the right hand side. Now, what should we do where we see I squared? We should substitute minus 1. Where do I get this from? From the two rules on the right hand side. So if I see I squared, I substitute minus 1. Notice that will be followed by I, so that is times I. Now minus 1 to the third power will give me minus 1. So minus 1 times minus 1 is positive 1, times minus 1 is minus 1. Multiply that by I. Now minus 1 times I will give me a minus I. Please note, my marker didn't make the dots on the top. Okay, there you go. So this is minus I. Number 3. We have I to the power 8. Pause the video, attempt it on your own, then unpause. So we can substitute I squared. So remember, we're always working with what's in the box on the right hand side. We're always working with this mostly. And I squared. So I squared to the power 4. Please forgive my marker, there's something wrong with it. So I to the power 4. So 2 times 4 is 8. Correct. So where we see I squared, we can substitute minus 1. Minus 1 to the power 4 is equal to 1. Do you agree? So minus 1 to the power 4 is 1. Number 4 and number 5. 3 times I to the power 9. So 3 times I to the power 9. So we have 3 times. What will you put in the bracket there? I squared, correct. So I squared is minus 1. So 2 times 4, if you multiply those exponents, 2 times 4, you will get 8, which means we are short of an I. So times I, that will give us 9. So 2 times 4 is 8 plus 1 is 9. I hope that makes sense. Where we see I squared, we will substitute a minus 1. Don't forget the I on the outside. Now, some people in error might do this and put root minus 1. This will now complicate everything and you won't get a real answer. You're going to have this root minus 1 in your final answer. Remember, we are simplifying here. So you should put an I instead. So notice that minus 1 to the 4th power is the same as minus 1 times minus 1 times minus 1 times minus 1. That will give you a positive 1. Please use your calculator to verify this. So 1 times I is I, and 3 times I is 3I. In the next example, what should you substitute in that bracket? Think about it nicely. What would you place there? Correct? I squared. I squared to the power 13. 2 times 13 is 26. Where you see I squared, you will place minus 1. Minus 1 to the 13th power. That's an odd number. Therefore, you will get a negative. When minus 1 is raised to an even number, it's a positive answer. When it's raised to a negative number, it's a negative answer. Number 6 and 7. Right, notice that the negative is on the outside. Make sense? That there's no brackets there, number 6. So the negative's on the outside. The only thing that's to the power 11 is the I. The negative is not included. Where you see I squared, you will place negative 1. Now 2 times 5 is 10, plus the 1I on the outside is going to give me 11. Okay, with me? So that's I to the power 1 on the outside. So 2 times 5 is 10 plus 1. Don't forget we're multiplying this I, will give us 11. Makes sense? So we are going to say minus 1 to the power 5. Will that give us a negative or a positive? A negative, because it is a negative number. It's an odd number. Sorry, it's an odd number. Therefore, we'll get a negative answer. Negative times a negative is a positive 1. So we'll get a positive 1 times the I. So 1 times I is I. Now with the fractions, it gets a little different, yet not difficult. When you have a positive I in the denominator, you will now multiply by the opposite sign. So if it's plus in the denominator, you will say times a negative I. Okay, you with me? If it's a negative I, you will say times a positive I. Let's see what I mean. So you will do the same to the top and the bottom. So looking at this one, the denominator here is a positive. This means I will multiply by a negative I over a negative I. What I do to the numerator, which is on top, I must do to the denominator, which is at the bottom. Then I will multiply horizontally. 5 times minus I will give me minus 5I. So 5 times a negative I will give me minus 5I. In the denominator, I will also do the same, multiplying I times I. I times I is I squared. A negative times a positive is a negative. Now, I have negative on the top, negative on the bottom. Do not make it positive. Don't say that a negative divided by negative is a positive. Rather do it like this. In the denominator, we have I squared. I squared is minus 1. So, we have negative negative in the denominator, a negative negative. So when you're multiplying a negative times a negative, it becomes a positive, and so we get positive 1. So your answer is 5I over 1, which will give us 5I. Number 8. So in number 8, notice that the denominator is negative. If it's negative, this means I will multiply by a positive and use the same thing that I see. So because I see I, I'll multiply by I, only thing from negative to positive. I hope it makes sense. Then we will multiply horizontally. 1 times I is 1I. I times I is I squared. Is that good? A negative times a positive is a negative in the denominator. So a negative times a positive is a negative in the denominator. I times I is I squared. 1 times I is I. So what will you do in the denominator? Think about it. Do you see I squared? What does I squared is equal to? I squared is equal to minus 1. So we now have a negative times a negative. A negative times a negative is a positive 1. We then have I squared over positive 1, which is equal to I squared. In the next example, we have 1 over 2I. Notice that the 2I is positive. I will then multiply by a negative I over a negative I. Multiplying horizontally, I will get 1 times minus I is minus 1. Sorry, is minus I. So 1 times minus I is minus I. 2I times minus I is minus 2I squared. I times I is I squared. Hope that makes sense. What will you do where you see I squared? Will you not put minus 1 where you see I squared? In other words, substitute minus 1 where you see I squared. How is that? So in the numerator we have minus I. In the denominator we have minus 2 times a minus 1. A negative times a negative is a positive. Now, will this answer, final answer, be a negative or a positive? It'll be a negative. Notice we have a negative I over 2. In that way it's written, it looks very complicated. Now remember, there's always a hidden 1 in front of a variable, right? So we can write this as minus half I. Okay, that's a more accurate way to write the answer. Number 10. We have minus 3 over 4I. Now that minus sign, you can apply it to the denominator. So multiplying it by a positive I over I, because y in the denominator you have minus 4i. So because the negative sign in a fraction can be used either in the top or the bottom, we would like to attach it to the bottom so that we can switch to the opposite sign when multiplying by I. So negative I will become positive I. So that's a more accurate way in which you can write it. So 3 times I multiplying will give us 3i, minus 4 I times I will give us I squared, but minus 4 I squared. So minus 4 times 1 is minus 4. I times I is I squared. Right? So here now, can you substitute something where you see I squared? Can you substitute something where you see I squared? Yes. So substituting, we will get minus 4 times minus 1. This will give us 4, positive 4, and on top we will still have the 3i. Notice it looks a little complicated. We could write it in a simpler way. 3 over 4i. Is that good? Easy?